So before we go too further on being able to differentiate what shoe you need, you have to have some sense of what type of foot you have. And so we kind of look at a spectrum of foot types, and I think the easiest way is to talk about flat feet or high arched feet are the most common. There's lots of variations that we see when we actually look at how a foot moves because there's so many joints and so many muscles involved. But it's easiest, I think, for most of us just to think of either a flat foot or a high arched foot. And for the most part, a flat foot is a foot that doesn't have as much stability. I use the car analogy a lot. It's like a car that has a suspension that's very old and has tons of mobility, and if you hit a bump, you're going to get a lot of flattening out of your suspension. And that's kind of what a flat foot is there's not enough stability in the foot, and it tends to flatten out. And that's what we use the term pronation. And so pronation is when the inner part of your foot collapses down to the ground, and it's a good thing as long as we have just a little bit of it. If we have too much of it, it tends to be, we call it hyperpronation or overpronation, and it tends to become a problem if you're doing it that way. The other end of the spectrum is the high arched foot, which a lot of us tend to think that we want to have more of a high arched foot, and we do. We want to have some because it gives you some leeway for your foot to flex. But if the foot is too high arched, it tends to mean that we have a very rigid foot, or we potentially can have a rigid foot. And in that scenario, it's kind of like you have a suspension of your car where it doesn't give at all. So you hit a bump or a hill and it just shakes the whole car, and you can kind of imagine if that's happening in your foot, it's going to transfer forces all through your foot and up through your legs and even into your back. And so in some cases, having a higher arched foot is more problematic than having a flat foot. And so it's important to have a sense of where you fit in that spectrum. And most of us are in the gray middle somewhere, but there's a few of us that are on the ends of the spectrum. And especially for those people who are more towards the end of the spectrum, we want to make sure that you're in the right type of shoe. So when looking at your foot to figure out what type of foot type you have, there's a few things that we want to look at. And so we want to see how high your arch is. And so you can see for me, I have a fairly low arch. There's not much gap there. And I have a fairly kind of long, narrow foot. And so that's part of it, is just looking at the static presentation of your foot. But we also want to see what's going on dynamically, meaning when you put your weight through it and you're walking, how much does your foot move, or how much does it hold its shape? So one of the simple ways that we can do to look at that is just to stand on one foot and hold your balance, and you'll see how much your foot wants to collapse in or flatten out, and how much the arch just wants to maintain. And so individuals who have pronation issues or excessive pronation issues will tend to roll in more in this fashion, where the inner part of your ankle and arch area will flatten out towards the floor, and the outer part of your foot will become kind of splayed or pancaked out, I guess is the way to put it. The other thing you can look at is you can do a step down, where you step down off the edge of a step that you can just use any step around your house, and you'll see how much the inner part of that foot wants to collapse again. And you'll see immediately whether your foot wants to be more mobile and flatten out, or whether it wants to hold and your arch maintain its height.
This is an example of a increased or hyperpronation foot type. If you watch the inner arch area, you'll see that it collapses down towards the ground, and you'll see that there's also an increased collapse or shift of the knee and the hip along with this, and that's why increased pronation can cause problems all the way up through the chain of the knee and the hip. This is an example of a neutral foot type. You can see that there's not an excessive amount of arch, but it's also not flat, and you can see that here there's a little bit of shift in pronation, but not much. This is an example of a higher arched individual. You'll see that when she stands on one foot, and then here when she performs a step down, that her arch height does not collapse hardly at all. Her foot is shifting for balance, but her inner arch area does not lower at all towards the ground. This is an individual who has a higher arch still with a very rigid foot type, so very little ankle or foot mobility as he transfers through the stance phase.
One of the other tests to identify what type of foot you have is called the wet test, which is you wet your foot and then you step across like a paper sack from the grocery store, and it will show you how much of your foot is collapsing, and it'll give you a sense of how high your arch is and how much you're imprinting your foot in the ground. And will also give you a sense of how straight your foot is or how curved your foot is. You can potentially do an ink outline of your foot and get a sense of that alignment. And that's important in the sense that when you look at the curvature of a shoe, you're going to see a lot of variation between how straight the shoe is from heel to toe versus how much curve it is. And so you want to make sure that your foot is fitting well and tracking well and letting the shoe work for you. If your foot isn't lined up well, then it's going to be uncomfortable and it's not going to last very long for you anyway. You're going to be uncomfortable with it.